Okay, hi folks. First lesson of April here, April 2nd. We're going to review chapter 5, things we would have talked about the week before spring break, or things you might have read yourselves during the e-learning there before spring break. Your assignment for today's lesson and for Tuesdays and Thursdays is you're going to be working on the study guide for chapters 5 and 6. That's going to be the only assignment. Again, in case we come back in May, we will test over the stuff, and I want you to have your study guides done. This is a 30-question study guide, so I'm going to try to be brief with this review to give you a little more time to work on that. Some of you have already started. When you work on the study guide, you need to go back to chapter 5 on our modules and open up the study guide there, because some of you have already started the study guide. Some of you have finished it already. But go back to chapter 5. I will put that note in your assignment here in this particular module, but go back to chapter 5 and open up the study guide for chapters 5 and 6 there. Any material that you need for chapters 5 or 6 is located there on the chapter 5 module. Chapter 6 is not published. There's nothing there. It's all in chapter 5. The notes and any quiz that you might need are there in chapter 5. But let's get to a quick review of what we would have done before spring break. We talked about how there were a lot of changes following the Civil War. And at the heart of that change was the growth of railroads here in Indiana that we're going to talk about in our next slide. This leads to new manufacturing developing and a lot of larger towns developing. Gary, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, certainly. Terre Haute grows. And big business begins to take over here in Indiana, but that does not mean agriculture is not important. It is still very important. It just changes with some of the new technology brought about. We're going to talk about that a little later. Lifestyles begin to change. Life in the homes begin to change. We see the change over from log cabins to brick homes or wood frame homes, better equipment for the home, better kitchen appliances and whatnot. Things just get a little simpler. And while Indiana's growing, we see the growth of a lot of big towns. It's still that small town feel that a lot of people really cling to. In fact, you had a little assignment before spring break, watching the John Mellencamp song "Small Town," and then writing a reflective paper on your feelings of a small town. Growing up in a small town, Brazil, or living here, as opposed to maybe living in a large city. Maybe your goal is to move to a big city someday. Maybe you've come from a big city and moved to a small town. But that was one of your assignments before spring break. And again, if you have not done those assignments, I've opened those up until April 10th. So make sure you go back and get those done if you haven't done them already. But let's look at the growth of railroads with Chugga Chugga Choo Choo. And let's talk about Madison and Indianapolis Railroad. This is the first major railroad in Indiana, the Madison and Indianapolis Railroad, or the M&I. This was completed in 1847, and this was the state's first major railroad that's going to stretch all the way from the Ohio River up to the capital city of Indianapolis. Madison is along the Ohio River on the Indiana side, and so that is why it's called the Madison and Indianapolis. This was very distinctive because of its north-south routes. Most major railroads will go east to west. This one went north to south. Next up, we have the New Albany and Salem Railroad, better known as the Monon. This was the longest of the early Indiana railroads. It's going to run for 288 miles, almost 300 miles, and it's going to connect the Ohio River with Lake Michigan. So from bottom to top of Indiana, the Monon will run. Altogether, by 1854, Indiana is going to have 18 different railroad companies and over 1,400 miles of tracks. Most of these were short line railroads, fewer than 100 miles. A lot of small town politicians and businessmen and farmers saw a lot of economic advantages for having their town being along a railroad line. Towns that weren't connected by railroads are going to have a hard time prospering. So this was very important to have railroads in your town. There were critics of the railroads who said that, farmers in particular were really a tough position, because if a railroad does not come through their territory, they would still have to transport their goods to the railroads, and the railroads would charge them higher rates because they knew how important the railroads were to the farmers. And if there weren't any competition, there's only one railroad accessible by the farmers. This was very difficult for the farmers. But again, remember the Madison and Indianapolis Railroad and the Monon, two very important early railroad systems here in Indiana. And then also be familiar with the tulip trestle. And these are images here of the tulip trestle. This is in Greene County in southern part of Indiana. This is the state's longest and most spectacular railroad bridge. It's a beautiful site. As we mentioned in our lessons before break, my stepdaughter had been down to visit that. Her fiance is from that part of Indiana, and she said it was really huge. It was just a sight to see. So make sure you know what the tulip trestle. This is the bridge for a railroad system in southern Indiana, and you can just see in that bottom picture, especially just how vast this bridge is. So let's move on to Indiana's railroad hub. Now, hub is a centrally located area that connects a vast array of areas, kind of like a spoken wheel. You look at the hub of a wheel and all the spokes that go out from it. Well, hub is the center of the wheel. Well, Indianapolis becomes the center of Indiana's railroad industry because it's centrally located. It's right there in the middle of the state. And this is going to spur on a manufacturing boom throughout Indiana, not just in Indianapolis, although Indianapolis will grow the most, but we will see that throughout. One of the key things to take from this slide would be the rise and fall of the interurbans. Steam-powered locomotives and railroads was the big development during the Industrial Revolution, but next up, the biggest development in transportation was the quieter electric-powered cars known as interurbans. These were mostly the electric interurbans would run short distances between towns and cities. These weren't meant to connect the Ohio River to Lake Michigan. These were meant to connect, Greencastle to Brazil, or Brazil to Terre Haute. Very quiet form of transportation and short transportation. These are going to have about almost 2,000 miles of interurban rails by the early 1900s, second only to Ohio. But these are also very dangerous. There are very few regulations, and when a head-on collision in 1910 killed 42 people, people started to really question how safe these interurbans were. And as World War II develops and we get involved in that, the need for steel and metals to go to the war effort kind of hurts the interurban growth. And then by the time the Great Depression hits in 1929, that's the end of the interurbans. But again, we did have a system that ran from Brazil to Terre Haute, and when they did the massive redo of downtown Brazil a few years ago, they tore up all the streets in downtown India and replaced them, recovered them. They found all kinds of interurban rails. Some of that was preserved, and you can see those at the Clay County Museum there in downtown Brazil. Let's move to changes in agriculture we talked about. There are fewer farmers in Indiana at the turn of the century. Does not mean farming wasn't important. It just means that big farms are developing. Smaller farmers are selling their farms off to bigger farmers because it becomes more efficient, easier to farm goods because of the introduction of new products, such as the Oliver chilled plow pictured here on your screen. The chilled plow was created by James Oliver, and this is going to be produced in the world's largest plow factory in South Bend, Indiana. Not the largest factory in Indiana or America, but the world's largest plow production facility. That's kind of a big deal because, again, agriculture is very important. The plow was very important. So we'll see other changes, such as the seed drill that will plant your seeds in a row, making it more efficient to plant your crops. Mechanical mowers to cut the hay, and reapers to harvest the crops. Excuse me. So a lot of major changes in agriculture are going to lead again to more efficiency, more productivity, but it also lends itself to larger farms, kind of pushing the small farmers out of work, as you see there. So, rural life is changing without a doubt. We see, as I said, we are seeing the decline of small farmers, and in the mid 1980s, we're going to see something created called Farm Aid 1985. Farm Aid was the combined efforts of the music community to help bring awareness of the fact that small farmers are struggling here in the 1980s. Pictured here, you have the three men most responsible for Farm Aid. John Mellencamp there on the left. Again, Hoosier rock star from the 1980s, 1990s, and still performing, along with standing there next to him on his left, your right, would be Willie Nelson, the country star, and sitting there between them is Neil Young, a Canadian rock star who's a well-known classic rock musician here in America as well. But their goal was to put on a concert to raise awareness and money to help the small farmers here, not just in Indiana, but across the Midwest. And again, things are changing quite a bit. We start to see the development of cars and phones on the farm. This is going to connect people to others, whereas before they weren't. Farming life was always a very isolated job and career and lifestyle. You have a large farm or a small farm, but you were out in the country and didn't have really access to your neighbors. Now, with cars in the early 1900s allow you to drive into towns and see people. Phones allow you to connect to people, to talk to others. This was especially important to the women on the farm. The wives, the daughters really appreciate being able to be connected to neighbors that might be 5 miles down the road. Men were always out working with the field hands or other farmers. The women were stuck at home taking care of the house and cooking, and they had a very isolated life. So they really welcomed the change to the new technology of cars and phones on the farm. I think that's all we're going to cover today for notes. I do want to mention that as you're working on your study guide, there are several items that you can find on your one of the other assignments from before spring break. The INTV news notes that you would have done. There was a handout to kind of copy over notes from a slides presentation. Things such as the American Railway Union, the Pullman strike, Hoosier Manufacturing Company that made the Hoosier cabinets, Ball Glass Works that makes the little blue tinted ball jars that a lot of women use to can goods. Talking about women in the workforce and child labor also in the workforce. And then Lewis Hine, the famous photographer who photographed factory life, concentrating on child labor. These are some of the items that were on that assignment that you will find on your study guide. So you need to make sure you do that assignment, and at least go back and look at that stuff to find those answers for your study guide. I think that is going to be it for today. So actually we could go, no, let's stop there today, and we'll pick this up tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but next Tuesday with a little bit more. So take this review and go back and work on your Unit 5 or Chapter 5 study guide. Again, going back to our module there. And we will come back on Tuesday of next week and continue this, get into the rest of Chapter 5, then move into Chapter 6 from there. So that'll be it for today. Good luck working on your stuff and continue to be safe. And we will talk to you next week. Bye.